Farwell Brown, and today I'd like to talk about the floods that have visited Ames in the past. We might call this a bit of a historical perspective on flooding. I do not see the wisdom of spilling water over the country at the rate that it has deluged over this section of lake. It seems to have been a perfect waste. The year was 1870, and Laverne Noyes was writing to his father of his reaction to the widespread flooding on the Squaw Creek bottomlands all along the east side of the Iowa State campus. Noyes was an undergraduate at Iowa State at the time, and he became a member of the first class to graduate in 1872. Laverne Noyes became a very successful manufacturer of farm equipment, especially the famous air motor windmills that later dotted the Midwest landscape. Lake Laverne on the Iowa State campus today bears Noyes' name. Would Noyes have some advice for us today? Probably not, because all that Noyes was concerned about was the flood waters surging over and through the timber pasture and the open flat hay and the cornland near the campus on the east side. There were 3 plank bridges that connected the village wagon trails with the college grounds and the open country across the Squaw Creek and the Skunk River to the south and to the east. There were no buildings of any kind where the floodwaters moved so menacingly, according to Noyes' way of thinking back there in 1870. Noyes can remind us that the flooding of our river and creek bottomlands came first. Our people came later, where the floods already were. Now, 14 feet of water stood on Iowa State's basketball floor in Hilton Coliseum in the summer of 1993. The waters of Squaw Creek ran over 13th Street, Lincoln Way, Elwood, and South Duff, damaging major buildings and many homes adjacent to the creek west and south of Lincoln Way. Skunk River was on a rampage and was in turn a part of the Squaw Creek's backup waters that in turn confounded the downstream surge from Squaw Creek's high waters. It appeared to have been an all-time flood stage for this area. Perhaps so. But a review of the history of flooding on the Squaw and the Skunk, dating from the earliest days of Ames, may be revealing. Note must be taken of changes that have taken place over the years. It is not just a matter of the amount and the rate of rainfall, although that is a major item bearing on the subject of flooding. In 1869, the year that Iowa State College opened for his first student class, George Tilden arrived from his native home back east and was making plans to locate in this small village where one of the primary indications for a bright future for the community was, quote, that there was to be a college here. The first newspaper in Ames was the Intelligencer, established in 1868. There are no remaining copies of that publication available until the issues of 1877. Stories of heavy rains were frequent, but few statistics were given on their pages at those earliest dates. With 1893 flooding vivid in our minds, we examined the rainfall records for the earlier years available from the Iowa Weather Bureau, now located near the Des Moines River, north of Des Moines. 1881 appears to have been the year when Ames, and most of the state as well, experienced an all-time high yearly total rainfall. Beginning that year, rainfall statistics for the Ames area are available. Rainfall in 1881 exceeded 50 inches for the calendar year. From the published official Iowa weather report for that year, we find that Ames had 17 4/10 inches of rain in July, with the greatest amount being 5 6/10 inches in one day. On July 9th, the report indicated that over 5 inches fell in Story County. Elsewhere in that same report, it is stated that during the 3-day period beginning on July 9th, the total rainfall in Story County exceeded 10 inches. Now, that 1881 report did not specify the location for rainfall readings. However, from records provided by the Iowa State College climatologists, we find that a total of 16.31 inches of rainfall for the month of July 1881 was recorded adjacent to the Iowa State campus. Such records confirm the state's report. Keep in mind that in 1993, the year of our flood, a recorded total of 16.39 inches of rain fell in Ames during the month of July. That appears to be the highest for the month of July since 1881, based upon rainfall records established right here in Ames. The final estimate for the total rainfall for the Ames area in 1993 for the year was 56.35 inches, as measured at an Ames weather station. Now that compares with the calendar year total for Ames for 51.9 inches for the year 1881, with the exact location for those readings not specified. A review of long-range yearly rainfall records suggests that 1993 was, in fact, a record year for the past 112 years. May and June 1993 rainfalls totals for 14.94 inches in Ames area, however, significantly exceeded that of the same 2 months in 1881 when the total was 9.02 inches. This strengthens the idea that 1993 was, in fact, a record-breaking year. Here at the confluence of the Skunk River and the Squaw Creek. However, flood studies suggest that rainfall alone is only one factor in flooding. Heavy rains preceded by sustained wet weather results in high levels of ground saturation, such that subsequent rainfall produces more runoff and hence flooding onto the floodplains. Other factors can be considered as well. 1881 has still more to reveal to us about the history of flooding the creeks and the rivers of central Iowa. Ames was hit hard by that flood of 1881. The July 23rd issue of the Iowa Register, published in Des Moines, and that was the forerunner of today's Des Moines Register, reported their correspondence findings with a dateline of July 21st, after he had traveled through the flood-stricken Story and Boone County area. His story read, "The storm at Ames and vicinity did lots of damage. The first train just passed through as we arrived in Ames since the storm. Great sheets of water yet covered the bottomlands around Ames." This is 1881. Keep in mind that the Register's dateline for that story was almost a week after the main rains had fallen in the Ames area. The Register's writer continued, "We left Des Moines Tuesday morning, going north. Everywhere signs of the great flood were visible. Many of the towns and no mail for 5 or 6 days. From Ames, the Iowa Register's correspondent moved on to Boone. In the town of Boone, every bridge is gone. Boone County is suffering worse, perhaps, in this direction than any other." He then visited Moingona and describes the scene of the heroism of Kate Shelley, whose heroic crossing of the railroad bridge over the Des Moines River on the night of July 6th has long been acclaimed. Moving now a few years hence, on May 19th of 1892, 11 years later, the issue that day of the Ames Times stated that, quote, "excessive rains of last week succeeded in stopping the Ames and College Railroad," known as the Dinky. We all remember the Dinky. "Travel became impossible early Wednesday morning. One of the bridges is badly damaged, and the grade on Squaw Creek has been washed away." Ames rainfall during the month of May that year was the 4th highest for over a 100-year period in the Ames area. That was 1892. Moving on now to 1900, the Chicago Northwestern had changed their original single-track main line to a two-track system. At that time, the elevation of the tracks across the river and creek bottoms adjacent to Ames were raised. Also at that time, a bridge span of some 60 feet length was placed in the railroad's right-of-way several hundred feet to the west of the Squaw Creek Bridge. That was to form an escape valve, making it possible to take the pressure off of the main railroad bridge over the Squaw Creek and also reduce the likelihood of roadbed washouts in the time of floods. Railroad bridge designers by that time were aware that it would be necessary to protect their main line bridge and tracks from pressure from future flood waters. When 6th Street was extended to Iowa State campus in late 1940s, the city entered into an agreement with the railroad to use that structure in a dual use by making of it an underpass for 6th Street. We all go through that area frequently. Today, now to 1902, 10 years later again, Ames experienced a total rainfall of 45 and 79 inches, which is 50% above normal approximately. In June, a total of 10 and 1/100 inches fell locally. July followed with 8 inches, and August with 7 and 1/12 inches, bringing the total 90-day rainfall at Ames to 25 and 19 inches, or over 50% of that year's total. At the time, local papers carried frequent references to continuous wet weather. On June 12th of 1902, a news item reported local damage to the CNNW tracks. It has been a long time since the railroads had to be reported in that respect, but the heavy rains of the past week or 10 days have made all kinds of trouble for the railroads in central Iowa. Now to 1909. Bottom lands around Ames were reported underwater again. A year earlier, a new bridge had been built over Squaw Creek on Lincoln Way, then known as Boone Street. The Ames Intelligencer of July 1st, 1909, had a lead story headed, "Heavens Unloaded. Injures the Road." Okay. A portion of a dike that had been built between the railroad embankment south to Boone Street, I should say, had been washed out. Now that dike ran from the railroad right away, the CNNW, down to where Lincoln Way is today, about where Elwood Drive is. All day Sunday, continuing now from that story, a force of men hauled dirt to build this up, and by sundown the gap was fairly closed. That 1909 account gives a clear picture of problems that the flooded Squaw Creek had created. The bottoms were underwater except for a small island in which many of the hogs and the sheep were herded Sunday, and until the flood had receded sufficiently so they could be taken off. A large flock of sheep south of the tracks would have drowned had it not been for a force of college and neighborhood people who had gone into the water and finally landed them on the interurban tracks. The 1909 news story referred to the new Milan Bridge down on Boone Street on Lincoln Way, stating that when it had been built the year before, that it had been thought that the 3-arch span would be adequate to take any potential flood waters. Just 1 year later, the floodwaters had practically filled the arches and had severely threatened that new bridge. The article continued. It was the opinion of experts who viewed the bridge Sunday that at least one more arch would be necessary. It was following a Squaw Creek flood of June 1918 that we'll soon come to, just 9 years later, that bridge collapsed. It should also be noted that prior to 1908, the county supervisors had maintained a dry land plank span in the Boone Road, that's today Lincoln Way, about midway between the Squaw Creek bottomlands and the college campus as a potential escape valve for anticipated floodwaters, very much as the Chicago Northwestern had placed that bridge span in their right-of-way west of Squaw Creek. Moving now to 1915, the September 29th issue. of the Ames Times carried a front-page report of excessive rain damage to roads and bridges adjacent to Ames. Quote, "The wooden bridge across Skunk River, east on 13th Street, went out early in the week, and others have been seriously threatened. A comparison of the years when Ames experienced flood damage reveals that while in some instances there was a correlation with widespread high rainfall totals, that has not always been the case. The rainfall may have been excessively high only locally for a particular short time periods. Flooding at any given location can be damaging either way." Just 3 years later, on June 4th, 1918, the Ames Evening Times reported heavy damage from, in their opinion, the most serious rainstorm that has visited this section in years. Rain coming down in torrents fed rivers and small streams which already were swollen as a result of the precipitation of last week, the story read, causing them to overflow and the flooding of hundreds of acres of bottomland. Squaw Creek, going on a rampage, has made a great lake between Ames and the campus. The high waters taking out the footbridge leading from the cinder path and great stretches of Lincoln Highway grade were washed out. You will see that in some of the pictures that are being shown. Streetcar traffic was abandoned. South Duff was underwater as the Skunk and the Squaw formed a vast lake in the area. All that you could see was water with a rim of trees along the Skunk River and the Squaw Creek in that area. Professor F.S. Wilkins, weather observer for the college farm, agronomy farm I should say, reported that 2 93/100 inches had fallen Monday night, bringing total rainfall since 7 o'clock Sunday night to 5 1/10 inches. The June 7th, 19 issue of the Times reported that 7.96, that's almost 8 inches, had fallen in Ames during the first 5 days of June in 1918. Precipitation in Ames for the month of May had been 6 45/100, with most of that falling after May 15th. The total rainfall for the 20 days through June 6th was locally registered at 14 41/100. All of this indicates that the ground all around Ames had become saturated by the arrival of the heavy rains of June that year. Local damage was reported to be high, with basements full of water. The lead in the Times story of June 4th was that shortly after 3 o'clock this afternoon, the Lincoln Way Bridge east of Ames gave way under the pressure of the rising stream. The Lincoln Way Bridge over Squaw Creek, that had been new just 10 years earlier, fortunately withstood the actual flood stage, but collapsed on the last day of June, having been seriously weakened by the flood waters. The Goddard family of Ames were driving over the bridge just as it collapsed late that day. They were rescued, but their car was left stranded on the remaining water and sewer mains that were located below the traveled roadway of the bridge. You will see that in the picture also, I believe. Lincoln Way was not yet paved in 1918. It wouldn't be paved until 1921. A 60-foot segment, that is, between the campus and Squaw Creek. A 60-foot segment of Lincoln Way west of the bridge had been washed out and was temporarily spanned with a plank bridge until the fill could be replaced. A temporary detour bridge, as you will see, was built around the washed-out Squaw Creek Bridge. It was not replaced with a new permanent bridge until late of 1921. As of that time, the only buildings that were in the path of the Squaw Creek floodwaters were a small number of portable hog shelters that were along the north side of Lincoln Way near the Beach Avenue corner. There was no significant development in the lowland areas other than the gas plant located just east of Ames. A few minor farm buildings existed in 1918 east of town on Lincoln Way, South Duff, or on 13th Street east of the Ames Cemetery. Except for the concrete bridge over Squaw Creek, the bridges over the Skunk River and the Squaw Creek to the south were of the old red bridge type design. And all of them were damaged seriously in that 1918 flood, and all of them, I believe, had to be replaced. The gas plant at the foot of the hill, just east of the town, was flooded and out of operation for some days as a result of that flood. The total rainfall for that 1918 year was actually normal. However, the 60-day total for the months of May and June placed that year near the top for a 50-year period. The significance of the 1918 flood to Ames was the damage to local businesses, destruction of roads, and bridges, and crops. As the population of Ames grew, the flood stages were increasingly impacting our city. More notice and more concerns were felt. In 1944, the floodwaters again visited the plains of Squaw Creek and the Skunk River adjacent Ames with a vengeance. Again, the flooding was acclaimed to have been extreme in its effects. This time it was the worst in the history of local flooding, to quote a local headline for that day. 4 53/100 inches fell in Ames on the night of May 18th, 1944. Following the next evening with 3 68/100. That totaled 8 21/100 inches, most of which was said to have fallen within a 24-hour period. The 1944 downpour of May 19th fell within such a short period of time that water was running in the streets to a depth of several feet in some locations. Water fell so fast that homes located in relatively high ground experienced torrents of water rushing in grade windows and filling their basements. Street gutters could not move the water fast enough. A number of Main Street buildings were filled with water that had entered by basement windows or exterior stairwells. The Sheldon Munn's basement was full of water the next morning. Thousands of dollars of merchandise were destroyed by floodwaters. Montgomery Ward, J.C. Penney, Car Hardware, Yonkers Store, and the Ames Mattress Factory were among those reporting heavy inventory losses. The Tribune had 14 inches of water on their floor at one time that night, and only one of 4 linotype machines were in working condition the next day. The Grand Avenue underpass was completely flooded. 2 motorists who had attempted to drive through it had to abandon their cars and swim to safety. The next day, the underpass looked like a war zone with tons of soil washed down into the roadway. Now, those who have lived in Ames very long are familiar with the more recent times when the floodwaters have covered the low-lying areas of Ames adjacent to the Squaw Creek and the Skunk River. The flooding that occurred in June 27, 1975, resulted in damage to new Iowa State Center buildings and was described as being, quote, the worst flood since 1918. The newspaper writer that day seems to have forgotten about 1944. Again in 1990, flooding in Ames raided the record books. In both those years, damage to both private residential and commercial property was significant. In a sense, those occasions were just more proof of the flooding pattern that had long ago been established. When preliminary studies of the reports had been prepared during the planning stage of the Iowa State Center, the emphasis was directed to some extent upon a term called flood proofing, I quote that, of the proposed structures. Now, flood proofing appears to have become somewhat of a new term, but it was not a new thought. In 1937, when plans for a new Ames High School building were on the local agenda, there were persistent suggestions that the land west of Squaw Creek and north of Lincoln Way would be a suitable school site. An educational consultant from Iowa City had concluded that such a site eliminated itself, to use his term, since the cost of protecting it from floodwaters might exceed the cost of the building in the first place. He was promptly criticized by proponents of the site at that time for dismissing the location out of hand without first determining the cost of flood protection. 125 years have passed since Laverne Noyes expressed his opinion of the waters that overflowed the Squaw Creek bottomlands when he was a student at Iowa State. In 1881, the flood that was so well recorded in history was 114 years ago. We are told that there were a number of factors that it may have contributed to the times and to the extent of past floods in this or any other geographical area. Such possible factors have included the construction of drainage ditches upstream to hasten the water away from cultivated fields and into the natural streams, the farming methods that have increased erosion. At this point, I'd like to recall a story that was written, an article written by Professor Fred Beckman. In 1913, he was the head of agricultural journalism at that time at Iowa State. And in that account, he tells about the fact that more money had been spent in the state of Iowa in draining land than had been spent or would be spent in completing the Panama Canal. There were some 50,000 acres of Story County land alone that had been drained with drainage projects between 1893 and 1913. The most significant change that has occurred over the years has been the increase in the number of structures that have been placed in the very spaces that repeatedly have been the flooded plains. In 1881, the damage was limited to fences, crops, plank bridges, and minor farm buildings. Each recorded flood experienced by us has had some increase in the quantity and the quality of man-made structures that were located in the floodplain. Bridges became larger and of more permanent construction. There are more roadways. Land that had been classified originally as swamplands by the federal government at the time Ames was founded, and that lay within what is now our city limits, have been filled to permit commercial development. We see this in pictures along South Duff before the development occurred and the way it appears today. Sometime before 1918, an earth dike was constructed west of Squaw Creek in the hopes of diverting that floodwaters away from the crops. By 1993, Ames had raised and widened the roadbeds adjacent to the Squaw and Skunk Rivers in the Ames area. Elwood Drive was a major improvement. It closely parallels Squaw Creek and functions as a dike as well as a roadway. All roadways are now paved. Paved parking lots and large buildings are there to be dealt with by the occasional rampaging waters that local streams try to handle in the manner dictated by the laws of nature. The results have been clear and obvious to most. Referring to the flooding along the Mississippi in 1993, Bruce Hannon, professor of geography at the University of Illinois, has said this: the flood damage and the resulting human anguish now taking place on the Mississippi River is not caused by Mother Nature. It is the result of the work of man. Hannon continued, flood sounds negative to most people, but to nature it is an expected event, historically bringing a rich supply of nutrients followed by a burst of growth. In 1993, televised commentaries called attention to the fact that when a dike broke on one side of the Mississippi River, the waters flooded hundreds of adjacent acres. And as that happened, water did flow off of hundreds of flooded acres on the other side of the river. Nature has had to be reckoned with. Water has the power to find its place on the map. The point is that when you protect one site, you in turn very likely jeopardize another. It is a simple principle that when you put rocks in a bucket, that bucket will then hold less water. Today, there is more recognition of such realities. A seemingly new consensus has it that the floodplains are a part of the streambed system. The floodplain is literally a part of Mother Nature's rain barrel, built into her system for both storage and for development. An historical perspective perhaps suggests that it is there that the matter rests. Ames has had a laboratory, so to speak, that has probably told us something about the pattern of flooding in the vicinity of Ames over the last 100 or more years. After all, the American Indians before us, the early Americans, the Native Americans, had the reputation of never locating their villages in floodplains.